So welcome everyone to this afternoon's Heidelberger Salon. My name is Alexandra Kemmerer. I'm head of the Max Planck Institute's for Comparative Public Law and International Law's Berlin office. And I'm very pleased to host this afternoon a very distinguished panel of 4 experts in global public health law who have been very active during this entire last year. It's now today almost exactly 1 year since the coronavirus hit here in Germany, and since we have started to live with certain restrictions. And the 4 experts we have with us today are probably people who have been much better prepared than most of us in the meeting and on a live stream today, because they have been done research and built expertise in the fields of global public health and international law, or at the intersection of global health law and international law for several years already. I'm very pleased to have with us today Dr. Alexandra Phelan of Georgetown University, Dr. Mark Eccleston-Turner of Keele University, Maike Voss of the German Institute for International and Security Studies, and my esteemed colleague, Pedro Villarreal, Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg. We have also with us today Leticia Casado. Leticia is a selected Max Planck Institute journalist in residence. She was supposed to be with us already last year. We couldn't realize that residential stay, and we hope to have her with us today. We hope we have her with us in the near future. And Leticia has been reporting for the last several months as a correspondent for the New York Times from Brazil. She's based in Brasilia. And I would invite you, Leticia, to give us at the outset of today's salon some observations and share some observations and analysis from the situation in Brazil today.
Hi, hello everyone. So here in Brazil, we are facing the worst moment in the pandemic. We have a new, more contagious variant that has overwhelmed hospitals across the country. And Brazil may soon turn out to be the most significant coronavirus hotspot, as the number of cases will probably drop in the US because of the vaccination. And we also may be the only one among the countries where the pandemic becomes a chronic problem. Yesterday, after a year of this issue, we had a record death toll, 1,700 people died in 24 hours. At this moment here, for you to have an idea, we have 19 of the 26 states of the country with more than 8% of ICU beds occupied. And we have no perspective to vaccinate all adults in Brazil. And we know that the vaccination is late in all the continent, but except from Chile. But that situation is a break from Brazil's tradition in the public health system. We have a national vaccination plan that was created during the 70s. And by that time, Brazil built a strong structure on public health system to vaccinate people. For you to have an idea, during the flu season, we vaccinate 1.5 million people per day. But those vaccines are produced here in Brazil. And we don't produce vaccines against coronavirus. We have 2 important public laboratories here, Butantan and Fiocruz, and they are maybe the biggest laboratories in Latin America, and they are among the most important laboratories in developed countries. So So it's quite different for us what's happening now. And when this crisis started, we felt that we had a different posture that we had before. And we can say that it changed after Bolsonaro, President Bolsonaro, because he doesn't believe in he's part of the anti-vax movement, and he doesn't believe in multilateral coalitions. So Brazil is not working with other developed countries now. We have like 250,000 people who have died because of COVID, and 20% in the past 2 months. So we are facing, we are very worried with what is about to come. Brazil has, over the past years, opposed to a proposal by India and South Africa at the World Trade Organization to lift intellectual property rights on vaccines. And those proposals had the intention to help the world to mass produce vaccine. And it was an important break from Brazil's traditional policies. And we think here that probably if this crisis happened in another moment, the posture of the country would be different, would be more collaborative, and well, that's it. President Bolsonaro also stimulates until now that people gather, that they don't use masks, and we had a lot of effects because of this. Brazilians went partying on Christmas, on New Year's Eve, and during Carnival. So when you see the pictures, you see that like we had thousands of people together, gathering, partying, drinking on the streets, on the beaches, like 2 weeks ago. And now we don't have enough places at the hospitals. So even President Bolsonaro, he went to the beach by the end of the year. And since the beginning of the pandemic, Bolsonaro downplayed the seriousness of this virus. He called it like a little flu. And he made a strong defense of the use of chloroquine to prevent COVID, even with despite all the evidences that it didn't work. So he ordered the army to produce chloroquine. It's like, I don't know, maybe in August. And he was importing chloroquine from the US. And we also had the Ministry of Health launching a website to orientate the doctors to prescribe chloroquine, even if you had a flu. So we don't know yet how many people may got affected by the use of those non-effective medicines that are really strong for the body and don't kill the virus. And we are actually the stage of a national and a domestic war again between the federal government and the states, because Bolsonaro has fought with governors, especially with São Paulo's governor, who is producing the only vaccine that we have now, that is Coronavac. And as Bolsonaro and the governor are political rivals, Bolsonaro didn't defend the Coronavac. So the states went to the Supreme Court, and those situations are really rare, because in the middle of this pandemic, this huge crisis and people dying, the president and the states are fighting at the court, because the president says, oh, I don't need to I don't think you should vaccinate. I don't think that I'm gonna buy Coronavac because I don't like China and I don't like São Paulo. So we had a lot of small situations, but that are very big, and they late the process. And Bolsonaro always, sorry, Bolsonaro has always said that he wouldn't do nothing to stimulate people to stay home or to wear masks. So when you see a leader doing that, you just go to streets, maybe. I don't know. I think a big part of the population is behaving like this because of the federal government. And we had never had national guidance to fight the virus. So this posture had a lot of influence here in Brazil. And we lost, he fired 2 ministers of health last year because they wouldn't defend chloroquine. Now we have a general in the ministry, but this general, he has no experience with disease controls or public health system. So we are kind of lost with no guidance from the government. And for example, yesterday I asked at the Ministry of Health, what is the plan to fight this new dangerous variant that's spreading so fast around the country? And they don't have a plan. They don't have, oh, we're doing this, we are promoting lockdowns. And we are not even making genomic sequence because we don't have structure and money. So it's quite a situation here now. And our vaccination campaign that is based on Coronavac, the Chinese Coronavac, started after a lot of countries, maybe after 50 countries started their own vaccination campaign. And so we are late in this urgent matter. We had vaccinated until now more or less 6 million people. It's about 3% of the Brazilian population. We are like more than 200 million people. So I think that is it. We have an issue here now.
Thank you very much, Leticia, for these observations and for sharing your experience now in Brazil. And I think these observations from the country that was second hardest hit by the coronavirus so far give us also a glimpse into the very complex situation that we are facing now, even so vaccines have been developed in record time. And one could say that also the World Health Organization's ACT accelerator has been quite a success. We are far from a kind of easy way to global solutions on that front. And I would now invite our legal and IR and global health experts to share their views on this situation from a more global perspective. And I would invite first Maike Voss. Maike Voss is project leader on global health issues at the German Institute for International and Security Studies, the SWP, in Berlin. Maike, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and also thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. And as you said, I'll give a brief perspective overview of international relations and global health governance. And there's so much to say, but I will try to make it as brief as possible. So I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a litmus test for collective action, global solidarity, but also a textbook example for trade-offs between global health and trade policies. I'd like to share some of my observation of the very beginning of the pandemic in 4 phases. This is more rather coming from a European point of view. So I think we started the pandemic early last year, January, February, with I call it shock-induced paralysis, in German Schockstarre. So from an international relations perspective, nothing really happened, although WHO ringed its loudest alarm clock and declared a public health emergency of international concern. I'm sure Alexandra will talk about this as well later. So we saw not really action, no preparation in countries for this. This was followed by, I call it introversion, so in February and April. So the occupation with oneself and the nation state. There was a lack of support also for neighboring countries and countries in the European Union. Maybe you remember Italy asking other members of the European Union for support when it comes to ventilators, when it comes to ICU beds. And there was not really a supporting nature even within the European Union. But as you may remember, we have seen the Chinese supporting with the supply of medical goods. So there was discussions early last year. There was followed, and I call this third phase, the remembrance of European values, or the awakening of Europe, in May and June, with pledging conferences hosted by the European Commission together with the World Health Organization, for research and development of vaccine therapeutics and diagnostics. And the new multi-stakeholder platform, the ACT-A, with its vaccine pillar, COVAX, then developed from there. The last phase, and I think we are still in it and maybe stay in it, I don't know, I call it global action in old patterns. And I would like to zoom into what I mean by this a little more. On three examples or three dimensions. First is the ACT-A accelerator as a new multi-stakeholder platform, but in a very traditional way. As you know, the ACT-A platform was built to accelerate the development and distribution of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, and it was or is designed as a pool. And a pool is a very traditional and commonly used tool in international relations. However, this ACT-A was never really used as a tool, since high-income countries have secured high volumes of vaccine doses early in the pandemic, knowingly leaving others unvaccinated. And I think this is what we now call vaccine nationalism. By doing this, they have bypassed COVAX and the ACT-A accelerator and kind of taking its power away. To date, I think the ACT-A is the best tool we have with all the difficulties. And it was also developed by immense speed. However, it follows a clear charity logic right now, how it's used right now. And it's far, far away from the promised narrative of global public goods that came from leaders, also from Germany and the European Commission. I'd like to now continue a little bit on criteria for access to these goods and come with an international relations perspective. As we can see, middle-income countries, except China, represents almost half of the global burden of coronavirus cases right now, but only have 70% of vaccine doses administered. So we can see that there's a clear mismatch. Countries like Vietnam, Thailand, New Zealand, Australia, and others have managed to control COVID-19 better than other countries, and also considered to so-called better prepared countries like the US or UK. So middle-income countries that perform better stand in the queue on the very back in the global vaccine rollout, and are therefore have a double burden. So they have to wait for the vaccine even though they perform better. So I would say performance in infectious disease control is no real criteria for having access to a vaccine. I therefore argue that neither good performance in infectious disease control nor manifested health system vulnerabilities and high caseload on COVID-19 are criteria for faster access. As we all know, it's rather purchasing power that ensures the access to vaccines. Some words on instruments, and I'm sure we will talk about this later in the discussions. As you know, Germany and also other countries block the waiver at the World Trade Organization, which is an instrument designed for exactly this kind of situations to deal with pandemics. And also the CTAP, the pool for sharing technology and know-how, is not really used as it's designed. So we have international instruments there for this kind of situation that are unused. And I am looking forward to, I'm raising the questions, why not? And what else needs to happen to make countries use these instruments in a collective action? And I'd like to share, or I'd like to get your insights and your points on this discussion. I'd like to conclude with some brief and maybe frank statements. I think the longer it takes to distribute vaccines worldwide and the longer the virus remains uncontrolled in large parts of the world, the more preventable infections and death we will see, the higher the chances for further virus variants we will see, the higher the chance the vaccine will not work due to the mutations, and the use of consistent health protection measures and public health protection measures such as lockdowns become necessary. The more expensive it will be to rebuild and make up for the loss of development in countries, especially in the global south. The more global trade and travel remains limited. And I think this is particularly serious for Germany as an export nation. And of course, this will all have a long-term impact on international relations. And I would say this is long COVID for international relations and policymaking. That was it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maike. I now invite Mark Eccleston-Turner, a lecturer in law at Keele University. And I would ask you, Mike, to present present a legal perspective on the abilities of the COVAX facility to deal with the complex problems we have now, which can be labeled as vaccine nationalism. And we are curious to hear your assessment of the technical and legal possibilities of the instruments that have been developed in coping with the current situation.
So thank you so much, and thank you very much for having me. So I think the first thing to recognize is the fact that the vaccine nationalism which we're seeing now was wholly predictable. In 2009 H1N, when the only other major experience we've had with an attempt at a truly global rollout of a vaccine during a pandemic, we saw the same sort of vaccine nationalism which we're seeing today. We saw high-income countries dominating the global supply of vaccines and administering large proportions of their population before any vaccines began to be rolled out into low and middle income countries. So the signs were there that this had happened. I think the question remains about why we as an international community have made so little progress on actually resolving those problems and addressing those problems. The reason for the domination of vaccine procurement by low and middle income countries during 2009 and also today with COVID are exactly the same reasons. It is advanced purchase agreements, which are contracts between a country and a vaccine manufacturer that is agreed ahead of production, ahead of a product being made accessible, which guarantees the government in question access to a predetermined set amount of those doses and also a prioritized access to those doses themselves. So typically what we know about advanced purchase agreements, because we actually know very little, because they're not put in the public domain and they are not accessible through freedom of information requests. We know that they give prioritization. So from reading the UK government's advance purchase agreement in 2009 H1N1, we know that the amount of vaccine the UK sought to secure was between 30 and 120 million doses. The UK has a population of roughly 60 million, so the UK was trying to secure at least enough vaccine to give everyone in the country 2 doses, which makes sense because we're talking about a vaccine that has a 2-dose strategy. But the UK government signed agreements only with vaccine manufacturers who were based in the UK at the time. And the terms of the fulfillment of the UK's advance purchase agreement had to be done prior to those manufacturers exporting any other vaccines to any other countries that they sought to contract with. And we can see similar patterns with COVID right now. We can't see the contracts, or we can see very limited bits of the contract, but we know that there is widespread use of these advanced purchase agreements, which are enabling high-income countries to secure as many vaccines as they can. 3, 4, in some circumstances, 5 times as many vaccines as they actually need to immunize their populations. While simultaneously, we know that there is a very limited global supply of these vaccines. They're a finite resource which are in very high demand by all countries around the world. And we have a very limited vaccine manufacturing capacity, particularly for the vaccines which are manufactured using an mRNA platform, such as the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. These cannot really be vaccinated outside of a very small number of plants in a very small number of typically high-income countries. COVAX was created in order to minimize or overcome this problem. The extent to which, COVAX was created to do 2 things, essentially. Number 1 was to act as an incentive for the development and as an incentivization tool, as a push tool to incentivize research and development towards the creation of COVID vaccines. Typically, vaccine research and development is very complex. It's very difficult. It typically takes decades and ends in failure. The fastest we've ever managed to develop a vaccine previously was around 4 years for the HPV vaccine. Whereas under a year into this pandemic, we had vaccines on the market which had received licensure as being safe and effective by national regulatory authorities. That is an extraordinary achievement. So part of what COVAX was created to do was to act as this incentivizer, this push mechanism. And they did that very effectively. They provided economic incentives, they provided financial incentives to vaccine manufacturers to engage in the sort of research that resulted in vaccines being made available so quickly and so easily. The other thing COVAX did very, very effectively was invest in at-risk vaccine manufacturing. So typically vaccine research and development takes a long time, and it typically ends in failure. And from an economic point of view, what the manufacturer would want to do is to wait for stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 clinical trials to be done, to create a regulatory dossier, submit it to national regulators, get that licensure as being, yes, this is safe, this is effective, we want to roll this product out, we want to purchase it, and then begin making the product. What vaccine manufacturers don't want to do is start making a product which will not make it to licensure, because then all of that investment, all of that manufacturing has to go in the bin because no one's going to buy it. COVAX sought to overcome this problem by, when stage 2 clinical trials results came out for a couple of the vaccines, particularly the AstraZeneca one, they began to invest in at-risk manufacturing. So AstraZeneca began to manufacture its vaccine once the stage 2 clinical trials had looked positive and the stage 3 clinical trials were still ongoing. That meant that the moment licensure occurred, vaccines were ready and available and had been through fill finish and were labeled and were ready to be shipped and ready to be deployed in countries. This significantly reduced the time between the vaccine getting licensed and actually beginning to be rolled out. These 2 things are undoubtedly positive steps for COVAX. However, COVAX's main priority and main goal was around the rollout and to act as a procurement agent of vaccines for low and middle income countries. On this point, I think it's fair to say that COVAX has been less successful. as is clear from the fact that vaccine rollout is only now beginning into low and middle income countries, there has been a significant delay between vaccines becoming available in high income countries and vaccines becoming available in low and middle income countries who are relying on COVAX. So there is a temporal delay and a temporal inequality between high income countries and low income countries. And in that time, you have exactly what Maike outlined, the fact that variants can spread. You can get new variants, you can get further spread, there will be further disease, there will be further mortality and morbidity associated with COVID, while predominantly in low and middle income countries, whilst they're waiting for the rollout of the vaccine from COVAX. The other inequality which exists within COVAX countries and non-COVAX countries is the actual target immunization. COVAX aims to roll out 2 million doses by the end of this year. That is sufficient for COVAX participating countries to immunize up to 20% of their population. Right now in the UK, we've immunized over a third of our population already. So COVAX countries COVAX participation countries need to be satisfied with immunizing 20% of their population by the end of the year, whereas in high income countries in the UK, but also in the rollout across the EU and the rollout in the US, we are already way ahead of that. So there becomes an inequality in what is considered a successful rollout of the vaccine between COVAX and high income countries. I think if by the end of the year, the UK had only immunized 20% of its population, we would consider that a failure within the UK, as would most other high income countries. But COVAX participating countries need to see that as COVAX as being successful. And I think that there is a clear inequality there, both in terms of the number of doses and the timing of when those doses become available for COVAX participating countries. The reason for this huge inequality, and one of the reasons for COVAX being less successful on the procurement side of it, is that COVAX as a mechanism is reliant upon the goodwill of states. It is reliant upon the goodwill of high-income countries to fund COVAX's advanced market commitment to purchase vaccines on behalf of lower middle-income countries. It requires solidarity from high-income countries to fund COVAX and allow COVAX to purchase low and middle income countries. And what we're seeing, as we've seen across the entire pandemic, is that solidarity, that commitment to multilateralism is less forthcoming during an emergency. We've seen instances of export controls placed on PPE, export controls placed on drugs, possible export controls on vaccines coming from the European Union. And this commitment, this solidarity, is hard to come by during a pandemic. And I think the point for me is that we should not be reliant upon the goodwill of high-income countries to meet the needs of low and middle-income countries during a pandemic. And that is why where that frustration comes from. That actually we waited until a pandemic was unfolding to actually begin to take concrete steps to try and address this. So COVAX was always playing catch-up. Whilst COVAX was being created through this multilateral effort from the World Health Organization, CEPI and Gavi, whilst they were getting in a room and actually creating COVAX, countries like the UK, the European Union, the US were already beginning to negotiate their own advanced purchase agreements, which would allow them to have the sort of prioritization which they, vaccine prioritization which they desired and which they actually achieved. So I think for me, one of the most important things that we can learn from this pandemic is that there is a need to address these issues in peacetime, that we shouldn't wait until we're in the middle of a pandemic to actually try and address these issues and bring these things under control, that there was a huge period of time where it was entirely predictable between 2009 H1N1 and COVID, where we knew an infectious disease pandemic would happen again. It was a case of when, not if. We knew that a vaccine would be our route out of said pandemic, and we knew that vaccine nationalism would happen. And during those intervening 10 years, we took very few steps in the multilateral stage to actually to prevent that from happening or mitigate against the effect. We waited until a pandemic to actually try and put these things in place, and I think that's one of the real failures of the multilateral system in that regard. One of the other potential inequalities in vaccine rollout from COVAX is infrastructure inequality. where if countries are not ready to receive doses because of problems with their cold chain or problems with their healthcare infrastructure, they may have to wait until they may miss their allocation from COVAX and then have to play catch up later on down the line. And again, infrastructure was a huge barrier during 2009 for countries to receive donated vaccines from the World Health Organization. We have known for a very long time that there are huge problems in low and middle income countries with cold chain infrastructure and with healthcare infrastructure. And during the intervening years, very little progress has been made to actually enable countries to receive vaccine rollout during a health emergency. And I think that's a real failure and a real damning indictment of multilateral efforts in this space. And I think I'll probably leave it there because I think Pedro is now going to pick up a couple of the points which I made, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, I think Pedro will now go into some of the problems that were already raised, in particular the solidarity issue, and also address the situation from a human rights perspective. Pedro has been working as a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for some years already on the question of the prevention of pandemics from a global health law perspective. And as I said, he was certainly one of the most prepared person at the Institute, but he also made us very much aware how much, as you have said, Mark, should and could have been done much earlier in discussing these topics. So Pedro, you have the floor now.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexandra, for the very kind introduction, and good day, everyone. I'm very glad to join all of you in what, in my view, is a very timely debate. And so, when addressing the phenomenon of vaccine nationalism from an international law perspective, so we're focusing on the legal dimension. So I will focus briefly on states' obligations with regards to procuring the vaccine for their own populations on one hand, and contributing to a global distribution on the other hand. So it might sound strange that I'm splitting these two obligations, but as I will argue, that is also embedded in the existing formulations of the right to health that need to be revisited. And so the key element for the vaccine, for the distribution of the vaccine, as Mark already highlighted and throughout his presentation, is related to the fact that there is a time pressure. All governments, all states are under immense pressure to protect the health of their inhabitants against the virus, and also to exit the current state of affairs where restrictive measures consist of quarantines, the closure of businesses, travel restrictions, or the package of them informally known as lockdowns, restrict individual liberties to a large extent and have a massive toll on economies. And this is the background of the race for a vaccine. So when addressing vaccine nationalism, and we can discuss ways in which existing regimes of international law can either provide solutions or actually pose limitations for these solutions. And I mentioned briefly too, as Alexandra already hinted, one is the limitations inherent to the right to health as it has been formulated throughout the years. And on the other hand, the role of international intellectual property rules. In the case of the right to health, what we see, particularly in Article 12 of the International Covenant of Economic, Social, Cultural Rights and its authoritative interpretations, General Comment 14, and legal doctrine, I might add, is a separation between obligations owed by states to persons currently in the territory and obligations owed to persons in other countries. That is extraterritorial obligations. They are both legally binding, but they have been distinguished from one another in terms of how these obligations are to be understood. There is indeed an obligation for states not to impede the enjoyment of the right to health by individuals, by persons in other countries. But the resulting question is, how can this obligation be understood in the context of the time pressure for a scarce resource and the vaccine hoarding by a few countries for the benefit of their own populations at the expense of the supply amid others? Could we go as far as considering that by hoarding, and we can discuss how would be considered that hoarding begins, after which threshold hoarding begins. Could we consider this to be impeding the enjoyment of health by persons in other countries? So this is a question that needs to be further discussed among the legal circles. And as for intellectual property rules, so this was the right to health, and what I think is a pending debate. And as for intellectual property rules enshrined under the World Trade Organization's agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property, known as the TRIPS agreement, we need to revisit this regime's underlying premise as being an engine for innovation. So according to the rationale behind this agreement, by protecting developers of technology such as medicines, which are health technology, through patents, granting these innovators exclusive rights for making, using, offering for sale, or importing a patent-protected product. This is supposed to foster innovation. And we can ask ourselves whether this has been the case equally throughout the globe. We know that this is not the case. Yet, of course, these rights are not absolute, since there may be situations in which states parties to the TRIPS agreement, all WTO states parties, 164, decide to authorize the use of a patent-protected product without the explicit approval of the patent holder. And Mark already mentioned voluntary licensing, for instance, through what is known as compulsory licensing. And that is the content of Article 31 TRIPS. So even though the TRIPS agreement allows for this compulsory licensing, ultimately this agreement did not address the structural conditions of inequality across states. It did not lead to a sufficient increase in national manufacturing capacities in lower income countries, national pharmaceutical manufacturing capacities, and maybe promoting investments in pharmaceutical R&D was not its core purpose. Regardless of this, the situation we see currently is a dramatically lopsided pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity at the global level. A number of middle and high-income countries concentrate this capacity. So for those countries where there is no such national capacity, Article 31 bis, which was an amendment, a recent amendment to the TRIPS agreement that entered into force in 2017, now allows to import, and namely those other states to export medicines through compulsory licensing, something which was previously more limited. But even if a compulsory license is issued for these purposes, or if the proposal for a waiver of the TRIPS agreement altogether mentioned by Leticia, Casado, and Michael Voss already, even if this proposal for a waiver would be successful, for those countries where there is currently no sufficient or rather inexistent manufacturing capacity, they would still need a foreign pharmaceutical company to actively make use of that mechanism. And if they do not use that mechanism, countries without the capacity are left basically without supply. And this is where initiatives such as COVAX for the global distribution play a major role. And moreover, and I touch again upon Michael Voss's point, so there is a required know-how on the production of a safe and effective vaccines against COVID-19. Even if the TRIPS agreement, there's a general waiver and so on, we will still need to make sure that manufacturers taking over the production of the vaccine are able to replicate this product. And that is why, besides lifting the legal restrictions per se, a commitment for a technology transfer from high-income economies mentioned by Maike would be required. And this is the reasoning behind the proposal by several lawyers specializing in access to medicines, such as Ellen Tuhun from Medicines Law and Policy in the Netherlands, aim at a more robust model of global solidarity in the production and distribution of safe and effective vaccines against COVID-19 by technology sharing or know-how that allows for making the most of the global manufacturing capacities. And lastly, to conclude, maybe in a more provocative note, I would refer back to a point on how to engage with the political drivers of vaccine nationalism, because an open question that Mark already touched upon is how can we grasped these political drivers of vaccine nationalism and the limited degree of solidarity that results from such a perspective. And in my view, the current structures of political accountability are rooted mostly at the national level. You see, national authorities or decision makers are accountable principally towards their own populations or voters in the case of democracies, who in turn will be most interested in the question of how their elected officials fared in securing doses for them. At the next stage, they might be interested in evaluating whether their authorities contributed to global efforts for distributing the vaccine. But first and foremost, they might be worried of how their efforts benefited them in getting the vaccine as soon as possible. And we can relate this to the political context in Germany. You already mentioned this at the beginning, Alexandra, how in Germany, the current political dynamics also help explain, what the approach by the what the approaches towards vaccine nationalism and global solidarity would look like. In Germany, there are elections scheduled for this year, and we can assume that voters will have the question of the vaccine very much in mind. A global reference for, I guess, for voters as well in Germany will be Israel. And I am very glad that Professor Eyal Gross from Tel Aviv University joined us today. I'm sure that Israel's vaccination story is much more intricate than what I can accurately portray now, but the world is looking at this country's vaccination strategy, and which for sure was driven by national political factors. I imagine that the current government in Israel will be looking to capitalize from the success of this vaccination campaign. So our concern, to conclude, my concern would be to what extent will Israel's approach, or as Mark said, other approaches like the ones from the UK, become a core reference for the rest of the world on effective strategies for vaccine procurement. Where does this leave initiatives fostering global solidarity, such as COVAX? And how can we further tackle these political drivers of vaccine nationalism from a perspective of international law? I think it is not sustainable to disregard them, since the success of any future models for enhancing solidarity depends on addressing these political drivers as well. I leave it at that. Thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I'm sure that Professor Gross will be willing to share some of the Israeli experience. But now we have on the panel Dr. Alexandra Phelan, and she has kindly offered to bring together some of the findings and statements from this panel by looking out to an international legal system for the next pandemic. Dr. Alexandra Phelan is a member of the Center for Global Health Science and Security and also an assistant professor in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Georgetown University, and she also holds an appointment as adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. I'm stressing this, or I want to stress this, because for our German viewers and audiences, this is a job description which is quite atypical, because in German academia, we rarely, if at all, see such an interdisciplinary job description. There have been some developments in the last years, but I'm sure that the pandemic will also trigger an enhanced level of interdisciplinarity on that level. But that's just as a side remark. We are now looking forward to your remarks. Alexandra, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and for the opportunity to speak today on an international legal system for the next pandemic. Vaccine nationalism, as has been discussed here by the other panelists, is perhaps the most perverse manifestation of actions contrary to the goals of global health law. Firstly, the goal of protecting global public health relies on this solidarity and cooperation to stop the spread of the pandemic, and the emergence of variants of concern that Maike mentioned that not only prolong this crisis and the lives lost, but also risk undermining the incredible progress made in developing the vaccines to date. Secondly, the goal of international law to prevent and resolve disputes emerging between states. Nationalism retreats from the multilateral order and entrenches legal and ideological positioning on these issues, and risks increasing the use of law as a tool for injustice and, as it was used in the past and today, colonialism. Thirdly, and most profoundly, global health law's twin goals of equity and justice. In many ways, global health law has left profound gaps when it comes to equitable access to vaccines, diagnostics, treatments, the right to health, and the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. So noting the risk that vaccine nationalism poses to not only these goals, the success or even legitimacy of the field of global health law, but also to international peace and security beyond, we must ask, how do we make global health law more comprehensive and more equitable to prepare for and respond to this current pandemic and the next pandemic? In addressing vaccine nationalism, how do we bring together the different fields of international law that are captured by the topical netting used to define global health law, from the international health regulations to international human rights, intellectual property, and environmental laws for this moment in time, and to ensure that we are better prepared for the next pandemic? There is a suite of international law reform open to states at this point. If we treat this moment as simply an opportunity for tweaking the current system or adopting highly technocratic and narrow instruments, we risk missing the critical systems reset that is needed to prevent the next pandemic. For mine, and this is why I'm in support of a new legal instrument, a framework convention on pandemic preparedness and response, or a pandemic treaty, that can entrench key political and normative considerations into the pre-next pandemic climate-affected multilateral system. As my colleague, Dr. Colin Carlson and I have written, it is easy to imagine a world that never fully recovers from COVID-19, driven by nationalism beyond just vaccines and a failure to address the equitable gaps that led to the scale of this crisis. It's easy to imagine a total state shift in global connectedness, driven by that inequitable access to vaccines and the maintenance of travel restrictions, immunity passports, or vaccine certifications. As we wrote, fragmentation begets fragmentation. Without multilateral cooperation, COVID-19 could redraw the world map. But this isn't a guaranteed path. There are alternatives, contingent on strengthening health systems and a multilateral system that actively engages with the underpinning tensions and conflicts that led to this vaccine nationalism crisis. We can find some guidance in assessing two key jurisprudential matters, sovereignty and fragmentation. The assertion of state sovereignty has received a renewed resurgence over the past 5 years. It is the principle used to justify state choices that impact people's health domestically and internationally. It is a principle that has been used to deflect accountability for reporting outbreaks, strengthening health systems, and for violations of human rights. At the same time, it has been a principle to assert self-determination, particularly in light of colonial and neo-colonial exploitation, including in global health, like the sharing of pathogens, data, and the risk burden of vaccine development. The last time we faced a crisis that prompted international law reform for global health was at the beginning of this new millennium. And this reform resulted with fairly unprecedented levels of ceding of sovereignty to the WHO through the revision of the IHR, namely, the required obligation on states to share information on a much broader set of health threats, to require domestic capacity building that was beyond the veil of state borders, the requirement that core capacities and control measures are implemented with respect to human rights. The ability for the WHO Director General, as Maike referred to make a declaration of an event as a public health emergency of international concern is a fairly profound ceding of sovereignty. And what we've seen is pushback on that declaration by affected states, whether we're talking about Ebola in West Africa or COVID-19. The fact that an officer of an international organization can make a public alert with significant economic and reputational consequences cannot be understated. And it is also unsurprising that we have seen the implicit weakening of this mechanism and its norms through state inaction in response to the alert. They're not disconnected. But rapidly from 2005 to 2015, we saw a significant shift in the international legal environment, with the clarification and reassertion of sovereign rights, in particular over genetic resources, including pathogens. While these rights are simply an expression of the sovereignty already afforded under international law, such sovereignty, as Pedro has alluded to, is not absolute. The classic example of this is human rights. However, we need to critically examine the theoretical and philosophical underpinnings that resulted in this assertion. In the late 90s and early 2000s, as has been mentioned, successive failures to address issues with access to medicines, in particular for HIV/AIDS, due to stringent pushes by the global north to vociferously prioritize intellectual property rights, resulted in international legal stalemate that continues to impact global health law, where intellectual property issues are simply deferred. As COVID-19 has shown us, we've hit the point where deferrals are no longer possible. In addition, this stalemate led to states seeking to rectify international inequalities in global health in other forums. While often pejoratively described as forum shopping, international law as a system means that forum queries are legitimate questions in attempting to determine the appropriate forum based on the laws and mandate of the institutional body to resolve a conflict in international law. States forum queried the WHA, the World Health Assembly, and the World Trade Organization and found them wanting. It is quite possible that the TRIPS waiver proposal from South Africa and India for COVID-19 vaccines will find a similar response. If the field of global health law does not step up to address this challenge substantially, we will see these issues just addressed in other forums. In response to the 1990s intellectual property stalemate, we saw countries assert sovereignty over genetic resources, including pathogens, and the development of access and benefit sharing regimes under biodiversity laws like the Nagoya Protocol. Under these regimes, access to pathogens necessary for global health surveillance and the development of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics is leveraged in exchange for equitable sharing of those benefits developed from their use. In the last 5 years, we've seen this final shift, where countries have resorted to populism that rejects scientific and evidence-based lawmaking, and nationalism drives a retreat from multilateralism, solidarity, and commitments to report and respond to pandemic threats. In the same way, the global health law has failed to address equitable vaccine access and intellectual property issues, and the corresponding proliferation of advanced purchase agreements, as Mark referred to, attempts to solve inequitable access to vaccines through biodiversity law has also failed. In both cases, systems based on bilateral leverage are insufficient when compared to multilateral commitments. In some ways, this has further reinforced other legal scholars' points about the fear of fragmentation and provides some jurisprudential underpinnings of the possible path forward. Andonas and Broj note that fragmentation is part of a dynamic legal system and the first step towards convergence and cohesion in international law. In her brilliant 2017 piece, Professor Anne Peters refers to this as the refinement of international law, whereby diversity, conflict, and even contradiction is a positive condition. We are at an inflection point in international law. If global health law as a field does not choose to reform the IHR or adopt a new instrument, these issues will simply persist in other forums and perhaps in other currently unknown forms or conflicts. ICJ Judge James Crawford referred to international law and fragmentation using Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. While we stand right now in the fragmented pieces of that gyre, nationalism, sovereignty, it will not stay that way. Like a transformer or a self-repairing robot, the fragmented pieces will come back together to center together in some synthesis, perhaps something new and unknown. To continue with Yeats, we must keep it front of mind that the unknown rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouching towards Bethlehem, is not necessarily the new international law gyre that may form, but the next pandemic. That is what we must keep front of mind. The only acceptable path forward is for novel international law that prioritizes equity above privilege, solidarity over solitude, reparations above charity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I can now see that we have already questions in the chat. I invite you now, all the participants here in the webinar, to put on their cameras again and also to pose their questions. If you have a question, just put a 1 into the chat And we can also apply the two fingers rule of the Institute. If you have a direct intervention on any point raised during the discussion, then just put a 2 and you will have the opportunity for a brief intervention. But now I would like to start collecting questions and comments, and then we give the speakers an opportunity to respond. I just hear that cameras are disabled. Selim, could you just allow participants to put their cameras on? We have already a question by Professor Duncan Matthews of Queen Mary University in London. A question to Mark Eccleston-Turner. You've written it into the chat, but it would be good if you just could repeat it.
Certainly, thank you for the introduction. Great presentation, Mark. I wondered if you could perhaps say something more about whether a solution to the COVID-19, or indeed the more general problem of the relative absence of vaccines in middle and low income countries, could perhaps be addressed by what we might call vaccine surplus. For example, the UK has said frequently that any excess surplus remaining at the end of the UK vaccination program will be made available to other countries. And I'd be interested in your views and others on the panel about whether that might be part of the solution to the problem.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question, Duncan. And you're absolutely right. The UK has stated that they will share excess on a number of occasions, and have quickly followed that up by saying, but only once we don't need our vaccine anymore. So the vaccine the excess only becomes available once we've met our own immunization needs, which is presumably to immunize everyone in the country with both doses that they require. And therefore, you still have this timing issue, this inequality in when the doses are actually delivered and rolled out into low and middle income countries. And this was exactly the case that we saw in 2009 H1N1 as well, where high income countries promised donations to WHO to distribute on through the vaccine deployment initiative to low and middle income countries. And we'd been promising those donations for several months, and we actually only began to ship the donations once it became clear that we could move from a 2-dose strategy for 2009 H1N1 to a 1-dose strategy. So suddenly we had twice as many vaccines as we needed. So and also 2009 H1N1 wasn't as severe as we had initially thought it might be. So then the argument of, yes, we have excess and it's ready to ship becomes much easier to make. The problem with using that is you still have the inequality in timings, and you also still have this lack of equity between states. They're not having the same opportunity to access the same resources at the same time. It becomes a charitable handout, a piece of solidarity between countries. And the more severe an outbreak, the less forthcoming that charity or that solidarity is going to be, and it doesn't resolve this fundamental inequality in timings. Which I think is actually really important, that it's not just about the number of doses, but when they become available and when you can begin to administer them. And I think that's a real problem that needs resolving.
Thank you. We have another question by Professor Eyal Gross, or a comment by Professor Eyal Gross of Tel Aviv University.
Thank you for this interesting panel, and great to see you all. So just to follow on the point Pedro made, so in Israel also we have general elections in March, actually the 4th round of general election in 2 years, which is another problem, but it is a related problem because I think the constitutional crisis and the health crisis are intersect in very important ways. And obviously Netanyahu's vaccine drive is also part of the election campaign. And of course, we can ask a lot of questions about this from an epidemiological perspective and global justice perspective, because in Israel, anyone above 16 can get vaccination. And the total percent of vaccination now for the population is already first dose about 51%, and second dose 37%. But if you look at the population above the age of 50, then it's already 82% got the first dose. And so now we can ask about it, of course, because we can say we know that globally speaking, it's better to vaccinate all the people and the people working in the health sector, and then the people who are 16 in Israel. But of course, I don't see any. I think that very much Mark, you said something that in peacetime, and you were using this metaphor. Of course, we are in this war metaphor. So I think we are in this kind of like in security dilemma where states treat the security issue, and like in security, they will first think about protecting their own citizens before they think about the global justice of the vaccination. And I think that, notwithstanding what Alexandra said, I think that, you know, it's very nice to think about equity in this distribution, but I don't think any state will agree, definitely after COVID-19, to a policy where it will be committed to global equity of vaccine before vaccinating its whole population, even though we know that actually, if the rest of the world is not, it's like marked, right? No one is protected unless everyone is protected, right? We know that, but I think that on the other hand, we know the states that we have this health nationalism, right, and this health security, which is very nationalized. So just very small points that came up in the Israeli context. Of course, the context of the duties towards the Palestinians, which is a big issue that I won't go into, but specifically question of international humanitarian law and human rights law, and we know that Israel has not vaccinated Palestinians, only Palestinians who come to work in Israel as day workers, but Palestinians from the occupied territories. But on the other hand, offered vaccinations to some friendly countries which support. So there's also vaccine diplomacy. This was halted for now because the Attorney General prohibited it, or he said he wanted to check the legality of Israel transferring vaccinations to other countries. But we see this question and a lot of questions about migrant workers and asylum seekers. So we can talk about this. But I want to say just two more questions that did not come up directly. But I think that Israel did this bilateral agreement with Pfizer, which was first secret, then published, but with part of it marked in black that we do not read. And this creates also a lot of lack of trust. So while there's a lot of vaccination, there is population, especially younger population, who does not vaccinate. Some are anti-vaxxers, but some are because actually they say, oh, Netanyahu is doing it for its political reasons. And at various level of conspiracy theories, or some are really strong conspiracy theory about COVID, but some are just, you know, about not trusting Netanyahu for a lot of justified reasons, also not trusting this and saying, okay, why, you know, he just wants to give us this vaccination, which was not properly approved yet. We are self-part of a trial now because this is a phase 3 trial and we are all guinea pigs. And the fact that in Israel is the only country where anyone above 16 can get the vaccination, we are being used by Pfizer as their guinea pigs. And a lot of people speak like that, and they say, look, why some of the agreement secret? And because it was also disclosed that Israel will give Pfizer this information about also without the names, but about the effect of the vaccination on different populations. And when we get the vaccination, they don't give us to sign informed consent. So I just want to show also that there are a lot of questions here about trust that come up with this campaign that is on one hand successful, on the other hand also creating some distrust that caused some of the younger population which can get vaccinated not to get vaccinated. And then there is another question, big question, which didn't come up, and it's maybe beyond the specific context, but the green passport, which now the EU also wants to adopt, and that has been very controversial because it's already enforced in Israel. So actually, I'm going for the first time on Saturday night after over one year to a live concert, but only because I can show in the application that I have the green passport from the Ministry of Health because I'm vaccinated. Otherwise, I cannot enter this concert. And there are a lot of questions about now the labor force and can you fire employers that refuse? So when you get the vaccination so widespread and the expectance from every citizen, that all those questions come up, which are maybe a different discussion, but I wanted to put it on the table. So I think these are some of the questions that came up, very, very pertinent. Like, I mean, I have to say that for me, like, you know, every day I have to like speak with, because the news wants to say like, vaccination is a hot topic here, and if you want to hear more later or if you have questions, I'm happy to address them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would now like to collect a couple of questions before we then give the panel a chance to respond. I first have David Patterson of the International Development Law Organization.
Yeah, thank you so much, except today I'm speaking wearing my hat from the Global Health Law Groningen Research Center at the University of Groningen, not at all speaking for IDLO. So thank you to all the panelists for their very interesting comments. A question is to any of the panelists who choose to reflect on it. And I think with this issue of international law, surely it's a question of use it or lose it. And if I can refer to the WHO Director General's statement recently that this issue of vaccine nationalism, the lack of interest in disseminating vaccines through to developing countries was a global moral failing. He framed it as an issue of morality, global morality. He was appealing to morality, perhaps charity even. But there was no mention of international legal obligations of international assistance under the Covenant on Economic Social Rights, this concept of progressive implementation, even the fact that states have an obligation to ask for assistance under international law if they can't realize their rights and so on. So I have the impression that there's a broad ignorance of the applicable international human rights law out there. And I just ask, is this also our fault for failing to make the case more strongly, and particularly global leaders for failing to refer to the international legal obligations as much as the moral obligations? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now I have also a question by Professor Stefan Oether of the University of Hamburg.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to link the discussion we have here with a parallel strand of the debate on the necessary reform of the WHO. I only want to remind of the forceful paper of A.I. Benvenisti in one of the last issues of the American Journal. And it's right, there has been a shift with a kind of the current international health regulations delegating some authority to the WHO, but the impression is that this was more on the books than in reality, and states are still tending to be very evasive with fulfilling their obligations. And in that sense, I would like to raise the point, having some remarks of the panelists on how they see this problem of the necessary reform of the WHO.
Thank you. And I have a final question by Professor Anne Peters, Director at the Institute.
Thank you for great input. Actually, do you hear me? Yeah. So first question to all panelists. Do you also share what Michael Voss said, that it looks as if it's collective action, but in the old patterns, that after a first moment of opportunity, when there was the rhetorics of global public good and global solidarity also as legal or potentially legal principles, that now, for me at least, this seems to have petered out in a way, that although it is said that no one is safe until everyone is safe, as Ayad said, in reality, it's not fully correct, because it's better to be safe first. And so it's just the simple repetition of how international relations have been conducted before, so that the catastrophe or the threat is simply not big enough for something revolutionary to happen. And following up on WHO reform, in that article by Benvenisti, he very much pointed out how the states themselves had, after the SARS crisis, prevented the health regulations from being stronger, and that, as far as I see it now, nobody really calls for a reform, for a formal reform. And third point, human rights, the right to health. I think there is, despite the operationalization of the human right, for example, by some national courts, there is still the big issue whether human rights are the right tool and instrument to tackle structural issues like a deficient overall healthcare system. I think that problem doesn't go away by trying to extrapolate the lengthy general comments of the Social Committee on the right to health, etc.
Thank you very much. I would like to give the panel now a chance to respond to these questions, and I would like to start in reverse order with Alexandra, and then going back to Maike and Leticia.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think I'm going to start on that last point by Professor Peters about about whether human rights are the appropriate mechanism. And, I think about what Alicia Aliamin has written about the raison d'etre of human rights is about accountability. And really it comes down to the ability for advocates, for civil society, for other states to also be using human rights frameworks and calling for accountability against these obligations. And that ties in nicely with what David Patterson noted, that why is there a lack of awareness of what the contents of the right to health, the contents of the obligations of the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress? Why is that a still maligned right? And in many ways, that actually also parallels with IHR obligations. So we've spoken about how countries haven't been fulfilling their obligations, and particularly in the last 5-6 years have been retreating in various forms. I mean, it has been a slow normative weakening. It hasn't been, from at 2005, there was a lot of political will, whilst it was managing sovereignty very carefully. But what we've seen now is countries just simply at the highest levels of government not being aware of what IHR obligations are. It's part of the reason why we see this push towards a pandemic treaty, a high-level political instrument to try and capture the political will at highest levels of government, because the IHR have been seen as a too technical, technocratic instrument or tool that has been relegated to sort of the part of WHO's technical guidance, and not as the normative instrument that it really was, with 150 years, 170 years of history behind it. So there are lots of parallels in there that I think that perhaps someone like Maike is perhaps in a perfect position to give some insights into the international relations and political realities of that. But we can't escape for the fact that whether we're talking about human rights, whether we're talking about the IHR, countries have managed to not be held accountable. And they've managed to not comply and allow these norms to weaken, and sometimes quite deliberately. Do I think WHO reform is on the cards? No, not right now. I think there is real worry that that would undermine WHO, and I do think that that piece by Ben Vinicius is very, very well done. But I think there is real concern that we would do significant damage to global public health if we did that. Same time, there is no appetite for reform of the IHR, which for those of us that have worked in the IHR for years cannot even begin to wrap our heads around how necessary reasserting those norms are. So this is where we think, and this is what I'll just end on, is where I think that a number of the international independent panels and different entities that will be examining the response will be talking about some form of systems reset, whether that be in the form of an instrument or some other high-level political commitments, because really this is all about norms.
Thank you very much. I would now invite Pedro Villarreal.
Yes, thanks to everyone who posed the question and who gave input. I will address some of the points which were raised. Eyal Cross, and particularly on the examples provided by Israel, not just in terms of what we can deem to be a successful vaccination campaign, but rather the ensuing legal measures. So what would legal measures look like in a post-vaccine world, right? And this is where Israel is becoming the global reference on what happens when gradually the immunization campaigns will lead to a situation where it is possible to think of certain legal measures. For instance, I believe Eyal Cross referred to compulsory vaccination, certain modalities of compulsory vaccination, which are currently out of the question in other countries. I guess this underscores the global divide even further, insofar as whereas Israel is already considering such measures, other countries are far from being capable even of envisaging such a situation where they may be implementing those measures due to the circumstances regarding immunization, because they do not have the same access to the vaccine. So this global legal divide between the haves and have-nots of the vaccine will also reflect in national level measures for those countries that had better access to the vaccine than those in comparison to those that didn't. Now next, on David Patterson's point, and that Alexandra already addressed more in detail on how there is a lack of awareness on international law obligations. Indeed, I would agree as well, and I would even add that this lack of awareness is coupled by the fact that COVID-19 is such an exceptional situation that there were no elaborate interpretations, pre-existing interpretations on the extent of the right to health, because how can you have a blueprint for such an unforeseeable and exceptional circumstance where we couldn't have imagined, right, that many of the things currently happening. Some persons may have posed the hypothetical scenario, but not much was made of it. So this contributes to what David Patterson mentioned on the lack of awareness and also the lack of interpretive work regarding the extent of human rights obligations by those the bodies in the task with the bodies with the mandate to do so. And lastly, in this exchange between Anne Peters and Alexandra Phelan, it does remind me of the fact that ultimately we still, at the international level, at the level of international law, there is the question of whether human rights would suffice to deal with structural problems or deficiencies. I can refer as well to the work done by Amefo Bogdandi and Michalis Ioannidis on structural deficiencies in the European Union. But the problem at the international level is that there is no proper legal framework on how to deal with these structural inequalities, because my impression is there is no consensus internationally on what the best means are to facing these structural inequalities. And we can at least be grateful that there has been consensus, for instance, for the existing version of the International Health Regulations, 196 text parties. But that is perhaps also, as Alexandra explained, a reason why it's so difficult then to reform, because consensus among so many diverging countries might not be so easy to achieve. So I would only finish by seconding Alexandra Phelan's comment on the fact that this contributes to the lack of appetite for reforming the IHR, unfortunately. So we'll see whether the momentum will lead to some useful progression in the way in which global disease surveillance takes place. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Eccleston-Turner.
So thank you so much. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to pick up on the point that Professor Peters made, and the discussion around potential IHR reform and the potential for a future pandemic treaty. And I think there's no surprise that there's a lack of appetite around this issue. As scholars who look at this issue certainly feel that there's a need there, but there's certainly a lack of appetite from states, because what the vaccine rollout and vaccine development with COVAX has demonstrated is that actually the multilateral system serves the needs of a very small number of countries, and it serves them very well. The UK has done incredibly well out of vaccine development and has had very little fallback for its breaches of the international health regulations. Why would it seek to change that system that works so well in its favor? And if you are if you're a low and middle income country right now, you would quite rightly feel abandoned by the multilateral system and abandoned by this system which is meant to work towards the public good. Why would you put your faith in that for another instrument? Again, and it's not just in the field of IHR or pandemic treaties. We've seen it through the idea of pathogen access and benefit sharing, through environmental conservation and climate change law. We have seen this failure of Maike called it us returning to the old sort of system of failing to address collective action problems. I think it's more accurately termed the utter hypocrisy of high-income countries to put forward these principles as being our guiding forces, when really we have no intention of actually meeting them in any meaningful legal manner. So I'm not surprised that there's a lack of appetite for this. I think that we're seeing a real failure of the multilateral system right now. And it just happens to be failing during a pandemic. I think it's wider systemic issues with the system. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Maike Voss, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I can, I think, perfectly follow up on what Mark just said. I think, and I've been thinking about this a lot. I think there is just one factor that can break the circle of, I call it now, circle of national vaccine nationalism in high-income countries, which is, I think, the dependencies on other countries with production capacities, especially in the case when vaccines lose their effectiveness. For example, with new mutants. For example, if a vaccine produced in a high-income country doesn't work anymore, but a vaccine from China or Russia is working, then I think we will see willingness to use international instruments, the WHO waiver, for example, to get access to well-working vaccines. I can't think of anything else. So when countries lose their strategic autonomy in access to vaccines, and this was the one point. I mean, we can talk ages on the IHR and IHR reform, but maybe just one point for the last minutes. WHO is a member state organization, and it's only as strong as members allow WHO to be. So, and I think this is a reason for a lot of problems we are facing. So, and as Alexandra said, WHO touches here and there sovereignty and autonomy of states, and they know where to cut off these powers the WHO has. So, yeah, maybe I'll leave it here due to time, but thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our experts here, and I should like to mention that all of you have not been only very productive during this last year, but also always available to different audiences and also to the public, which I think is one of the learning experiences also of this pandemic, that it is really important to create large audiences for scholarly expertise in that situation. And therefore we have also at the Institute established, or that's one of the aims of our Journalist in Residence program. And therefore I would like to give the last word to Leticia Casado, who will, from the side of those people who are multipliers within larger publics and into the media, who has been following this discussion and will also continue to work with us at the Institute during this year. Leticia.
Thank you. So, yes, I just wanted to say that I think that all those international instruments in which I'm not an expert, I think they are very important, especially at this moment, because, for example, when I hear you all talking, I feel a little bit like a pariah, because my country doesn't have vaccines because we didn't buy vaccines. So our problem is like it's so far from your reality. And I think that many other developing countries or poor countries are facing this kind of problems that seem unreal at this moment of the pandemic, because how can I say, well, I don't have a Pfizer vaccine here because our government didn't accept the Pfizer's offer. So, and I would love to receive the COVAX facility vaccines and to vaccine 20% of the population, but they will be delayed, and I have no perspective of vaccinating I don't know how many million people. And so, yes, I think it's very important that the international community think about how to use all those law instruments to stimulate countries to buy vaccine, or using, I don't know, maybe the green passport for people to travel. So maybe some governments will feel like more interest in solving this problem, because as you said, like, nobody's safe until everyone is safe. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the discussion today has shown very clearly that we are facing not only a public health crisis, but also many crises at the same point. Of course, multilateralism, one of those challenges, And as Alexandra has pointed out so clearly, we will see a transformation of international law, and hopefully the international law landscape will be open to constructive inputs also from legal academia. I hope that we will continue this exchange in the months to come. I would like to thank you all here on the panel and all the participants, but also all our viewers. And thank you very much. Have a great day all, and see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alexandra. Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.